It's a book that attempts to take seriously political language and political imagination, the way that Americans have talked and talk about a national project, and the way that we imagine it. Imagination is very closely connected with action. It's difficult to do what you can't envision. And because what's possible to do in politics is in part what we can imagine together, the conditions of possibility in politics have very much to do with what we can say to one another and how we talk about the kind of project a country is. So this book is an account of one way of looking at the American project from within. And as Paul said, it starts from outside. It starts with a debate in the winter of 1775 in London about what thoughtful people should make of the strange and extreme demands that were issuing from the eastern seaboard of North America and the English colonies. The Americans, in the documents that led up to the Declaration of Independence, were already using the language of inalienable rights, of consent as the basis of legitimate government, of the right to rebel against a government that withdrew from the terms of consent. And thoughtful observers like Samuel Johnson, who was the literary giant of his age and who made and ruined reputations with a word, thought this was either, as he put it, a charter of anarchy. That is, that it was impossible to build a political order on these principles because they were too explosive, too extreme, and too indeterminate, too open to the interpretation of each individual conscience. If you want to get a sense of the flavor of what he said, you can think of Justice Scalia's dissent, law students, in Lawrence against Texas, and the argument that the Liberty Clause of the 14th Amendment, as interpreted by Justice Kennedy, had become the clause that ate the rule of law by authorizing conscience as a license to withdraw from social order. Johnson also believed that the Americans were, and no one in London, no one in England at the time missed this, the grossest kind of hypocrites, because the liberty that they were demanding included the liberty to be undisturbed in keeping and managing their slaves. And so Johnson famously asked, why is it that we hear the loudest yelps for liberty from the drivers of Negroes? Johnson clashed over the meaning of the American insurrection as it started with Edmund Burke, who was another great conservative, another skeptic about absolutist and general principles, someone else who might have sympathized with Justice Scalia's anxieties in Lawrence v. Texas. But as Burke looked at what the Americans were doing, he suggested that it was possible, just possible, that they could build a new kind of political community, a new kind of political tradition out of these strange and explosive elements. So the book opens with an account of what Burke saw when he looked at what the Americans were doing. And I'll read a little from that. As Burke spent the London winter musing on the American crisis, he reinterpreted the Americans' actions, contrary to Johnson and to much of the colonists' own rhetoric, as part of a living tradition. That's not to say that Burke was sanguine about the Americans' prospects. The colonists' image of freedom was a new and radical thing. Its most explosive element was the doctrine that people were naturally free, formed governments to protect their inborn rights and interests, and could take down and rebuild those governments as they saw fit. It was the heart of Burke's thought, like Johnson's, that freedom was an achievement of culture and government which had to be tended reverently to keep it vital. Society and government came first, and individual freedom was their finest fruit. By imagining freedom as a natural fact, existing outside and independent of government, the colonists reversed that relationship. They held that humans could envision and create governments that suited the demands of freedom. For Burke, this ambition courted anarchy. A people who have torn down a government may find that their rights are rags, their law in shreds, and that they have no power to recreate what they have destroyed. In this respect, he and Johnson shared the suspicion of other critics that the American doctrines would put the axe to the root of all government. American success, in Burke's eyes, might be no less alarming than failure. Burke found himself forced to consider that the Americans might have discovered new and hazardous truths. He reported in his speech on conciliation that a strange and unsettling thing had happened in Massachusetts. The first British tactic against the rebels was to withdraw the Bay Colony's government. In Burke's words, confident that the first feeling, if not the very prospect, of anarchy would instantly enforce a complete submission. London threatened the Americans with the loss of the greatest Burkean right of all, living under settled law. This measure was meant to induce, in the phrase of another time, shock and awe, followed by obedience and proper gratitude to authority. Instead, in Burke's language addressing the House of Commons, a new, strange, and unexpected face of things appeared. Anarchy is found tolerable. A vast province, Massachusetts, has now subsisted in considerable degree of health and vigor for near a 12-month, without governor, without public council, without judges, without executive magistrates. This experience shook Burke's premise that people who claimed natural freedom and tried to remake their governments accordingly would fall into anarchy. Burke again. Our late experience, that is of the Americans, has taught us that many of those fundamental principles formerly deemed infallible are either not of the importance they were imagined to be, or that we have not at all adverted to some other far more important and far more powerful principles, which entirely overrule those we had considered as important. The Americans' inadvertent experiment suggested that a people could break away from tradition and authority without destroying social order. Perhaps anarchy was not the inevitable graveyard of radical theories of freedom after all. If so, then it might be possible to remake society along new lines. This seemed to Burke an extremely dangerous idea, one freighted with as much threat as hope. For all his sympathetic defense of the Americans, he offered as a major reason for peace with the colonies that war would only encourage more experiments in tolerable anarchy. And Burke said, "I am much against any further experiments." Burke might have suspected that he couldn't stem the tide of visionary reform, but he urged his government not to engorge it. In the eyes of one of their most acute British defenders, the Americans were attempting something new, which they likely could only halfway understand and which would turn out to be either revelatory or ruinous. They were shaping a language of authority on antinomian premises and a language of legitimacy based on dangerously open-ended ideas of freedom, consent, and legitimate rebellion. They were creating, that is, a tradition out of repudiation and insurrection. There was no knowing in advance whether such unstable materials could form a viable tradition, but the American experiment had to become that tradition or fail. And the next section of the book is about what was made of the Declaration of Independence in the years leading up to the Civil War. And the anchor and hero of this part of the book is Frederick Douglass, the escaped slave and abolitionist, who argued powerfully for the facially difficult interpretation of the Constitution as an anti-slavery document. The chapter opens with a very quick account of how Johnson might have seen the Declaration of Independence itself. I'll read that, and then I'll go on to describe Frederick Douglass's decision to stick with the Constitution and try to transform it rather than reject it. 14 months after Burke and Johnson clashed, the Declaration of Independence seemed to confirm Johnson's bleak estimate of the Americans. The Declaration asserted natural rights in their vaguest and strongest form: life, liberty, and that wide-open phrase, the pursuit of happiness. The colonists used these indefinite and, their word, unalienable principles to justify a right of rebellion as open war took hold between American subjects and their faraway rulers. Surely this was the Republican fanaticism and anarchy that Johnson detected in the colonists' earliest pronouncements. The Americans' hypocrisy was also on display. After proclaiming human equality and the right to resist tyrannical force, they listed this among the king's offenses. He has excited domestic insurrections among us. That is, the British government had promised freedom to slaves who abandoned their masters and staked their loyalty to London. It was one degree of hypocrisy for slaveholders to talk of liberty, another for them to base their theory of liberty on universal human equality, and still a third to claim that the kings freeing their slaves breached their inviolable freedom. And what was their rebellion, after all, other than a domestic insurrection? If Johnson had penned a satirical declaration of American rights, crafted to illustrate his case against the colonists, his text might not have departed far from Thomas Jefferson's. And now a little about Douglas and his view of the Declaration of Independence in relation to the Constitution. Frederick Douglass had every reason to reject the past, throw out the Constitution along with all its compromises with slavery, and call for a new birth of freedom based on the natural rights of men. That path was clear. His mentor, William Lloyd Garrison, and others had laid it out. Douglass was certainly angry enough to take it. Instead, with his anger and intelligence, he reinterpreted the past in a way that made it not just the prelude to the present, but a prophecy of a different future. Why? A contrast is helpful here. Douglass's way of understanding the Declaration and the Constitution was nearly opposite that of the Chief Justice of the United States, Roger Brooke Taney. 4 years after the address of Douglass's that I'm discussing in this chapter, which was in 1852 in Rochester, Taney wrote an opinion in Dred Scott v. Sandford, one of the most notorious decisions in American law, that seemed to annul each of Douglass's sources of hope. Dred Scott declared what Douglass had denied, that slavery was a settled part of the constitutional order. The Supreme Court ruled that slave masters kept their rights to their slaves, even when they traveled to free states, and that the Constitution forbade Congress from outlawing slavery in Western territories. Taney went further, arguing that white supremacy was a constitutional principle. Free blacks could not become citizens of the United States, according to Taney, because at the time of the founding they were regarded as beings of an inferior order and altogether unfit to associate with the white race, either in social or political relations, and so far inferior that they had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. Showing a keen eye for the workings of caste, Taney named 2 examples of colonial laws that degraded blacks: bans on interracial marriage and criminal laws setting special penalties for blacks who struck whites. Douglass declared the Constitution an anti-slavery document. The Supreme Court ruled the opposite. Douglass insisted that ordinary citizens could interpret the Constitution. Taney held that the Constitution's role was to settle certain questions permanently, making the racism of the founding generation binding on everyone after. Douglass found his source of hope, the Constitution's anchor and ringbolt, the thing you tie to, in the Declaration. That is, he interpreted the Constitution as an imperfect effort to make real the promise of the Declaration. Taney's answer, what to make of the Declaration, was relentless. True, he conceded, Jefferson had written, "All men are created equal." But when a slaveholder wrote those words, a reader could make sense of the contradiction in one of 2 ways. Either Jefferson meant all white men, or he and the other slave owners who signed the Declaration were hypocrites, and it was unacceptable to imagine them as hypocrites. Taney, the men who framed this Declaration were great men, high in literary acquirements, high in their sense of honor, and incapable of asserting principles inconsistent with those on which they were acting. On its face, this was praise of Jefferson and his allies, but the praise was a trap. It made moral imbeciles of the founders by denying that they could have held any principle or staked the country to any principle, would be a better way of putting it, higher than those that they themselves lived by in their most disappointing moments. More important, it treated living Americans as constitutional serfs, bound by the limits of earlier generations. Principles of equality that Jefferson and others had failed to make real, their descendants would now be prohibited from pursuing. Taney wrote with exaggerated regret that these prohibitions were the price of a constitution, which secured political order by erecting permanent principles. That was how a country achieved integrity and stability. Douglass insisted on the opposite. Integrity was a quality Americans might achieve by repudiating some of their principles, slavery, white supremacy, and deepening others, such as liberty and equality. Maybe he could understand repudiation as a national ideal because it had been near the heart of his own experience. In a memoir published in 1858, Douglass recalled being sent to Edward Covey's plantation, where severe treatment was expected to break the young slave's rebellious will. When Douglass's flight into the woods led nowhere, he slunk back to his quarters, knowing he could expect a whipping. On the next workday, his master declined to beat slaves on the Sabbath. Covey approached Douglass with a horsewhip. As Douglass told the story, they fought for 2 hours. He drew the white man's blood, and the whip never touched him. Other slaves died for less, and their masters were seldom punished. For whatever reason, Douglass's resistance had a different result. Covey never mentioned the incident and never tried to touch Douglass again. Douglass called his fight with Covey the turning point of my life as a slave, second in importance only to his later escape from slavery. He explained his choice to resist as an act of self-preservation, even though it put his life at risk. His wish for freedom had become intolerable in the humiliation and helplessness of slave life. If he'd not asserted that wish against Covey, it would have gone extinct. The story expressed Douglass's idea of the kind of integrity that freedom required. Not custom, obedience, or even simple consistency, but willingness to insist on what seemed overwhelmingly right and true in oneself. Assuming that a larger coherence would grow out of that concentrated, sometimes desperate point of resistance was an act of faith. It resembled the choice of slaveholders to sign a document that others denounced as a charter of anarchy, pledging to it their lives and fortune and our sacred honor. It took the thing many of them most feared, a rebel slave, to understand that wildest part of their spirit extended to everyone as a permanent part of American freedom. So the argument of this section, in a way, is that one of the most important facts about the Constitution is that someone officially excluded from its political community could advance the interpretation of its meaning that became authoritative, could identify with it as a common civic focal point for arguing over the meaning of freedom in American community, and that it was possible for him to prevail. Now, just read just a little bit, then that's sort of a gloss on the kind of thing that Douglass was doing and on demands within the tradition of American political language and constitutional language to expand the scope and depth of the freedom ideas that it contains. The argument is that the Declaration of Independence, uncapitalized, has become not just an original document, but a kind of genre of action, a way of making a demand of the community. Here's how it goes. Douglass amplified the same spirit that infuriated Samuel Johnson and left Edmund Burke divided: insistence on one's own rights, integrity, and conscience against all received authority. Douglas's declaration made real a nightmare of the founding generation: slave revolt, a domestic insurrection on their own principles of liberty. His act redefined the principles of the American founding, giving its promise of freedom larger scope and richer meaning. It showed that the first rebellion reached further than those who made it imagined. Each Declaration of Independence turns a privilege into a right, an indulgence from a superior into an inherent power of human beings. In defiance, a slave's dignity ceases being the master's plaything and becomes the boundary where the master's abuse stops. As Douglas wrote to his former owner on the 10th anniversary of his escape, "In leaving you, I took nothing but what belonged to me." Each declaration says, in effect, freedom in politics, in conscience, in my own body, was never yours to give me. It was always mine, and it still is. My freedom is not the gift of your power, but the standard I will use to judge your power. Each declaration carries the potential to destroy the order it challenges, perhaps even to shake the basis of all order. The original declaration asserted a people's power to resist and replace their government, which is what brought the charge of anarchism against the colonists. Douglas condemned a class of property and the economic order that rested on it. What he called freedom, the law and the Constitution regarded as theft. But each declaration also contains something generous and constructive, the beginning of a new kind of order. The act of rebellion begins in self-certainty. The American colonists had no doubt that the king had violated their rights, and Douglas was sure that he had to resist or die an inner death. He observed at Rochester, "There's not a man beneath the canopy of heaven who does not know that slavery is wrong for him." But just as Douglas meant to show, identifying with the part of oneself that resists oppression can imply identifying with that part of every person. It's possible, of course, to keep the impulse selfish and the principle solipsistic, but integrity and the very impulse of rebellion pressed the other way. It would have been unthinkable for Douglas, having reached his truth as he did, to join some free blacks in holding slaves of his own. His rebellion also implied, for him, supporting equality for women. He was one of a handful of men to sign a Declaration of Sentiments extending the original Declaration's demands to American women in 1848. And the motto of his newspaper, the North Star, began, "Right is of no sex." Douglas found in the American history of rebellion, with all its parochialism, hypocrisy, and selfishness, an impulse toward broadening and deepening personal freedom into a new form of community, which was his to claim and extend. Just trying to decide whether I want to read one more short passage. As the part of the book that I've read from so far sets up the argument that a very charismatic, powerful image of freedom as a kind of radical self-assertion, even though it was underspecified and deeply inconsistent in its application at the beginning, and it was not at all clear whether it could form the basis of a social order or would ever find any consistent application, became a feature of American political tradition that made it possible for people demanding richer and more generous forms of freedom as the premise of social order to present themselves as more American than those who had the existing law and the precedent of constitutional framers and interpreters on their side, that it embedded a kind of idea of constitutional prophecy, if you will, within the public language of American constitutionalism, American political self-understanding. And this is not a new observation. It's something Lincoln insisted upon, and it's something that in a certain way, in the political language of the campaign of the last 14 months, Barack Obama, I think, has also insisted upon. His language has included a subtle but significant recasting of a perennial idea in a new direction. The perennial idea, which every presidential candidate and every president says, is that American politics rests partly on fidelity to founding documents and founding principles. Everyone says that, but people can mean slightly different things by it. And when Obama uses the language, he's pointing, I think, in a direction that would have been familiar to Douglas and would have been familiar to Lincoln as well, and some 20th century presidents too, to the idea that what we're loyal to is not simply what has been or what now is or what was announced at first, but a possible future that doesn't exist yet, whose content we can argue about and imagine, partly by claiming and working through the multifarious language of the tradition that I'm writing about here. So it would actually be really great for me if in our conversation we could get a little more contemporary, though what I want to do in the book is set a larger historical frame in which to understand what we're doing, what's happening now. So rather than my reading that last section, why don't we start to talk? All at once. Lucy?
What would a 2010 Declaration of Independence consist of, given that with the current economic crisis we're remodeling our society? I mean, is it Barack Obama's campaign speeches, or is there something more?
So a wonderful question. In 2010, what would a Declaration of Independence be like? What would it say? So a lot of the book after the part that I read is about the fraught attempt to produce a political community, both in language and imagination and in institutions, that can both honor the sense of infinite possibility and dignity that is the individual register of this image of freedom that I'm talking about, that can reconcile that or hold that alongside the fact that people are also deeply interdependent and that their ability actually to insist on themselves and to be the authors of the lives they think they ought to be able to live is deeply and pervasively shaped by the institutional context they find themselves in, and that context in turn is pervasively shaped by political decisions. So I think that if the challenge is to put together the image of freedom that is so central to parts of the American political imagination and the fact of interdependence, then a declaration of interdependence might actually be closer to the thing, a way of reviving and reinvigorating the language of political community and of responsibility to one another, not only in our intimate and local circles, but also across the country to people as citizens or as residents or as social members, which is something I think that Obama and his campaign distinguished himself by being able to talk about in a way that had been difficult for, it seems to me, for many American politicians in recent years. One of the kind of formative thoughts around the book came when I found myself early in 2005 compulsively watching and rewatching the 2004 address that Obama gave at the Democratic National Convention, where he said, some of you might remember, very simple things along these lines. If there's a grandmother who's choosing between getting her prescription filled and making her rent, then that diminishes my life, even if she's not my grandmother. And I tried to understand why I was so engaged by this speech, and realized it was because he was talking about fairness and solidarity in a way that sounded fresh and genuine and American, and that I hadn't heard serious national politician do that in a way that resonated with me in my short political adulthood. So part of the investigation into the history of political language in the book began by trying to understand why that was so difficult and how it was that he was doing it. Because on the one hand, the thing that he was saying, my life is implicated in the life of that grandmother, regardless of our having no other connection, was possible only because he was speaking as an American and talking about national bonds. He wouldn't have said it in that setting in the same way, in a truly cosmopolitan way. A grandmother in Cambodia, I'm equally implicated in her life. But at the same time, the reason it was so difficult to say had to have something to do with the American political language that he was speaking in which this hadn't been a familiar note. A Declaration of Interdependence. Hey, yeah.
You said that Barack Obama could sort of re-envision these founding documents in a way that Lincoln or Douglas could, but you suggested hasn't really been done so much since then, during the 20th century. Do you think it's because were the documents sort of more open to interpretation as in Douglas's time, and they sort of become ostracized over the centuries, and where Obama, as a constitutional law professor, sort of realized they were more valuable? What do you think about that?
So I think I probably misspoke a little bit. I think that for a lot of the 20th century, there was some active attempt to update those ideas. And one thing that's very interesting is that Obama's doing it in quite a different way from some earlier presidents who also tried to respond to economic crisis by devising a language for government's role that could fit with older American ideas about personal freedom as the key to personal dignity. So Franklin Roosevelt, though in some ways he was all over the map, did have a recurring theme that the New Deal was an update of the ideal of freedom, and that he was taking the social meaning of the 19th century principles. Like, you should be secure in your life, you should be free in your choices, you shouldn't be subject to arbitrary interference from outside that you can't control and can't see coming. He saw the kinds of social guarantees that the New Deal provided as serving the same ends in a complex industrial society where the kind of thing that just happened to the world economy could happen in the industry you were working in or the region you were living in, and suddenly your economic reality is flattened, as surely as if the king's soldiers had come in and burned your house. Obama hasn't tried to use the language of freedom as his anchor and recast it in a different direction. He has talked more about images of duty, responsibility, service, community. Interestingly, that's a political language that has only been central to the way that presidents have talked about the country over the last 20 or so years. Those words are very much at the heart of the language of both of the presidents Bush and also Bill Clinton. Much more commonality in their image of what the sort of moral meaning of social life is than you might expect. And my own sense is that in some ways, from 1980 forward, it became very difficult for a lot of reasons, some of them having to do with a real rhetorical coup by Ronald Reagan, who really did reimagine the tradition in a very anti-regulatory and very libertarian way. It became very difficult to talk credibly about a positive role for lawmaking, for government as this sort of one of the shaping forces of the landscape that we all live on. And that the most plausible way of acknowledging the kind of moral force of interdependence was to talk about it in very concrete ways that were real in people's own lives. Like, everyone knows what community means or what responsibility means or what service means in a very concrete way. And that was how the Bushes and Clinton talked about the meaning of having ties beyond yourself. So I think, but the way they talked about it was not distinctly political. It had no particular relation to the role of the state. The only political thing about it was that it was the president saying it. So I think what Obama has tried to do in a way is to make that language more civic while recognizing that it's a lot of the heart of familiar political language right now. If someone asks a question, I will give a shorter answer. How's that for a deal? Or, hey, Noah.
With the victory of political liberalism over communism or fascism after World War II, for the first time in a long time, is a clear international realm. It's open to be colonized by liberal values in some sense. So the ideas that spawned the American Constitution now have an opportunity, I think, to spread into the international realm, and there's been a series of attempts to do that. But the greatest resistance to those ideas that you just brought up in the passages that you read about inalienable rights for every man and woman, those basic ideas, the biggest resistance that I've seen, or one of the largest resistance, is from within the liberal political movement itself within the United States. So you see liberals that are arguing against internationalizing rights, for instance. Why do you make it, first of all, do you agree with my assessment? And second, why do you make of this contradiction in the political liberal movement?
I don't know for sure whether I agree with your assessment. So if you would be generous enough to give a couple of anchoring examples, then I'll have a clearer sense of whether I agree with you about that.
Okay. If I go for lunch sometime with friends, American colleagues of law school, at times when I'm describing the international justice movement, the idea that we're going to hold military and political leaders accountable under an international system of rights and obligations for certain crimes, they resist that, even though they're strong believers in a similar system in the United States.
What reasons do they give?
I never fully understood the argument about why there's a concern about internationalizing these ideas.
Yeah, I don't know. I guess it seems to me that if you took the visionary version, the democracy-spreading, freedom-spreading version of the Iraq invasion, for example, as an attempt to extend liberal values globally, which people in our contemporary sense of political liberals opposed, that would seem to me like a case where the problem was that the American tradition of tolerable anarchy and constitutionalized insurrection is not utopian and undermining of order in the way that critics like Johnson imagined, because it's actually a tradition. It's the kind of paradoxical tradition that Burke thought might be possible, though very unlikely, a tradition of insurrection and repudiation, but that the aim of tearing down and remaking a political society along lines of ideal principles actually is utopian in the pejorative sense. It is actually the kind of thing that people like Burke opposed, for example, in British imperial rule in India. That wasn't your example, so I'm not speaking directly to you. But it strikes me as a point where people whom we identify as political liberals may, for credible reasons, understand some attempts to internationalize liberal principles as not the kind of thing that I'm defending in the book, because outside of a kind of tradition of understanding authority as having an anti-authoritarian form while still being authority, there's a difference between the kind of change you can work from within a tradition and the kind you can work outside of it. As for things like the International Criminal Court, I would have to talk to them, I would have to know who they were and know what reasons they were giving. I'm sorry not to be able to elucidate more.
Procedural reasons, why people are against that. But I was more interested in the spreading of human rights and the attack on the idea of international human rights from some people within the liberal political movement within the United States or within Canada also.
Are they just one question, are they pluralists or are they America Firsters?
It might be from a pluralist standpoint.
Yeah, some people, of course, are very concerned about whether human rights is a form of imperial self-assertion. Maybe that's what's bothering them. I'm sorry, I'm sort of out of response. Yeah.
It sounds like you've set up Edmund Burke as the protagonist to Frederick Douglass, the new book. I was curious about why you chose Samuel Johnson to be sort of a co-protagonist.
Well, I really wanted to get at the tradition of the Declaration of Independence from outside in two ways. From outside the United States, to see how it was viewed, its principles were viewed from the center of liberal, cosmopolitan, commercial society. And outside of it in time, because the Declaration is not yet the Declaration in 1775, it's a bunch of colonial complaints. I picked Burke and Johnson because Samuel Johnson's pamphlet attacking the colonists as either lunatics or criminal hypocrites is an amazing piece of political polemic. It is just brilliant point for point. He has, for instance, this great description. What does he call the Americans? He calls the Americans these zealots of independence, these lords of me, and he puts me in capital letters. He has this image of what he sees as the hollowness of the demand for personal autonomy, where he imagines a Bostonian and his dog who just can't deal with political authority anymore. So they run west together. They don't stop. They run and they run. They cross the Allegheny Mountains, past the line where the king has forbidden them to settle, and finally out on the frontier they collapse in exhaustion, and the master gives the dog some sensible order, and the dog tells him to shove off, and then Johnson says they congratulate each other on their sublime liberty. So it's just, and if you were to make the case against American freedom now, you would, whether you were a conservative or a liberal in your starting point, you would go, I think, with that kind of take on what it means socially, that it's a formula for mutual indifference and self-involvement. If you started from the cultural right, you would say, well, we have this culture of self-expression and self-exploration, the kind of moral image that grounds the Lawrence v. Texas decision, but it's really just a lot of trivial dalliances and self-involvement. It doesn't add up to anything. It gives people a license to be irresponsible. If you were starting from the left, you would say, look at our devil take the hindmost economy, where if you get rich, you're virtually deified, and if you lose, it's your own fault. So I think Johnson also remains in some ways a really powerful expositor of the weaknesses of the tradition. And Burke is great because he is a conservative, an iconic conservative, but one who, unlike so many conservatives in our own time, and really so many anyone's in any time, was both deeply engaged in the responsible decision-making of power and seemed almost compelled to imagine the lives of people who were power's victims and who couldn't speak for themselves. He was a great defender of British India against imperial abuses, and he was an astonishingly articulate voice acknowledging that the Americans might be onto something. And he used this great phrase, tolerable anarchy, which stuck in my head from the time I first read it. Neil, did you?
I'm thinking about the bicentennial and Justice Thurgood Marshall was reflecting on the Constitution. We did this in 5 pages in the Harvard article.
So that question makes me really happy, not least that I'm going to be here in the fall with you as a colleague again. And I think that part of what's so interesting about what Douglas is doing is he's operating at the outer limit of plausibility in this political tradition of invoking the Constitution, right, as a sort of common ground of terms or principles whose meaning is, on the one hand, deeply contested, but on the other hand, treated as being in some way part of who we all are, and so authoritative as to us, even as we're dividing over its meaning, and even as in that division we're remaking it. And the Civil War in some ways can be understood as a great vindication of skepticism about whether you could ever do right by these principles, right? I mean, they're invoked by both sides, the right of secession, the claim of unalienable equal liberty on the abolitionist side, the claim of union. I think there's a way in which, two thoughts. One, that a living tradition betrays history. And a tradition has this wonderful kind of ambiguity in its etymology, that it comes from tradere, which means to hand over. It's related to traduce or betray. And my understanding is that in early Christian Rome, it was used, among other things, to refer to those who handed over fellow Christians or other members of oppressed groups to the authorities. So what a tradition, on the one hand, is something that's handed down, but it's also something whose meaning is changed each time a new generation lives by it. And to the extent that part of its authority is a claim to continuity, it is actually, in some ways, an exercise in self-mystification. And that may be, I think it's a really powerful way of concentrating the paradox in what I was calling the paradox of a tradition of repudiation, which claims to be a tradition, and which has this originalist habit. And I think that in some ways, my own sense of it, and I ultimately do have the instinct to defer to you on all basic questions of constitutional professionalism, and I mean that in the most respectful way. I think that a hazard of this way of having a political tradition is that it tends to a certain forgetfulness, because the very fact that we want so much the founding documents themselves to be identical with our lived best version of ourselves can lead to a kind of willful blindness about their real content, which ironically is also forgetfulness about all of the democratic effort and all of the interpretive effort and will that went into building the bridge from there to here. So in that way, I think my heart is with Thurgood Marshall, the second Justice Marshall, in some ways. But I think the way that Americans have done what he's doing, including the way he did, had so much to do with this kind of odd, partly self-falsifying, self-transforming way of interpreting what we do. Do we need to? Hi, Natasha. So are we too fragmented to make a political tradition a live thing that actually makes productive political action possible now? I think that a partial answer is the extraordinary mobilization, sense of possibility that around the campaign of the last year, that in part brought a generation and a half of people into a way of experiencing politics as a way not just of playing cleverly by a set of established tactical rules, but actually acting together to remake some of the rules of collective action. The appetite that people had for that and the capacity they showed to make that experience real seems significant to me as a point against the thought that we're hopelessly fragmented, especially the fact that I don't think the campaign simply recapitulated old partisan divisions in more charismatic language, but actually anecdotally, from the person I work for to a number of relatives strung across the Midwest to neighbors in West Virginia, it made a kind of appeal across some lines that have seemed fairly rigid in recent politics. Another answer, though, is that it's really an open question. And a charismatic campaign, even if we're going to focus on Obama for a moment, is not a revival of governance yet. And part of what the book became in the course of writing it was a suggestion that we should understand what happened in the campaign, people who had a part in it or people who just watched it, not just as a gift from this charismatic guy, but something that we together did, which is very much part of a tradition of acting politically and of understanding what we're doing in doing that, and that it was really a democratic capacity that was reawakened, and that doesn't go away even if a candidate disappoints, and that effort doesn't end even if a candidate wins. But that's sort of the book is a gamble in that way, but it's intended as a gamble that loads the dice. What are you going to tell me we need to do now?
Well, I was going to suggest if you'd all like to move back here, we have some refreshments, and we can continue conversations there. And eventually there's also sound books. So if you join me, thank you, Jed, for being here.
Thank you all very much for coming. I really enjoyed the conversation.